Good morning. My name is Paul Shabus. I'm a lawyer at Blake's, and I specialize in anti-corruption law. And I want to talk to you this morning about the developments in anti-corruption laws in Canada and the importance of adopting anti-corruption policies and practices to meet the stepped-up enforcement of these laws recently in this country. You don't have to look far today to see that corruption is in the news. We've read almost daily about SNC-Lavalin and other issues in Quebec involving others. Recently, there were reports of the fine of the company in Calgary, Griffiths Energy, for $10.3 million for admitting an illicit payment of $2 million to the wife of the Chadian ambassador, a country where they wanted to do business. And a couple of years ago, a company called Nyko Resources in Calgary pleaded guilty and paid almost $10 million in fines for buying an SUV for a Bangladeshi government official. So we're seeing the scope of these fines increasing, and we're also seeing stepped-up enforcement. This follows a trend in the United States that has been going on for many years, and on the slide I've shown you we have 10 of the largest settlements under the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, including at the top of the list Siemens, where we've included the $800 million they paid. That was the money they paid in Germany, but in fact they paid another almost $700 million in fines in the United States. What's interesting about this list is that almost all of the names except for Halliburton, KBR Halliburton, are foreign companies to the United States. And that reflects the fact that the U.S. authorities are not hesitant to pursue foreign companies that have a business presence in the United States for corrupt practices or bribes they may have paid elsewhere. In Canada, as I mentioned, there are recent stepped-up enforcement trends. The RCMP, after really doing very little in Canada for about a dozen years under this act, for which Canada was harshly criticized, has now established two specialized units in Ottawa and in Calgary dedicated to investigating international bribery and to enforcing the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. I mentioned the Nyko case, which I've put in the slide there. You'll see, too, that in addition to the fine, Nyko is subject to onerous probation conditions, requiring it to retain independent third parties to conduct full audits, to provide comprehensive reports on anti-corruption compliance to the RCMP and to the court. Nyko is only the beginning of this stepped-up enforcement, and as I mentioned, more recently we saw Griffiths Energy plead guilty. And I should pause to note that both of those cases involved guilty pleas, where one is usually given a certain amount of credit for pleading guilty. But the court and the police made it very clear that they were strongly influenced by what has been happening in the United States and the need to impose significant fines that would have a meaningful impact on the companies to ensure that there is compliance with these laws. So today what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the different legislation that affects businesses in Canada, and while they may be Canadian-based businesses, they may also do business in the United States or in the UK and elsewhere. And so I'll talk a little bit about our Canadian law, the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Bribery Act that was introduced in the United Kingdom a couple of years ago, and also, plain and simply, the Canadian Criminal Code, which prohibits bribery of both public officials and private bribery in Canada. So let's turn first to the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, which is the Canadian legislation. You'll see that this is a criminal act, so it prohibits bribery of foreign public officials by criminal sanction. That includes both fines and the potential for imprisonment. Bribes do not need to be cash, they can be anything of value. If something constitutes a material or tangible gain to the foreign official, it is a benefit, and that benefit, of course, can vary, and what can be material or tangible can vary from country to country. What may be a very insignificant amount to someone in North America could be a great deal to someone in a third world country. So we have to look at things like gifts, hospitality, travel, accommodation, tickets to events, and other kinds of benefits directly or indirectly that go to the official. So for example, it's one thing to fly an official over to Canada to show them your product. It's another to fly the official and their family over to see the product and then to tack on a trip to Banff or even Niagara Falls as well. Those could all be recognized as inappropriate benefits to the official, which would be done to induce that official to do business with you. Foreign public officials itself is a term that's very broadly defined. It includes any person who holds a legislative, judicial, or administrative position in any level of government. So it can include national, state, local governments. And it also includes employees of wholly or partially state-owned or controlled corporations. And that can be particularly important in countries such as China, where many of the companies one deals with are directly or indirectly owned or controlled by the government. In addition, bribes paid to relatives or to political parties are prohibited. So again, it's a very broad scope for what constitutes a public official. There are 3 exceptions currently in our law dealing with bribery. One is if the bribe is permitted under the laws of a foreign state. I must say that that is becoming increasingly rare, and you should not count on that anywhere. A second one is the reasonable expenses, and I've mentioned that in the context of bringing someone over to see a product, promote a product, explain it, as necessary for legitimate business expenses. Those would not constitute bribes. The third one are what are called facilitation payments, and I'll just call those very small bribes in order to speed along something that you might otherwise be entitled to, such as a license or a permit that on its face you'd be entitled to, but it may take a long time to get it, and you want to speed up the issuance of that permit. As I'll come to in a minute, Canada is now taking away that small bribe exception. I mentioned that, of course, the company can be liable to criminal sanction, and companies under Canadian law can be held vicariously responsible for the acts of their employees, their agents, or contractors if that person manages an important aspect of the business. Penalties for breach of the law include unlimited fines, so it's 10 million today, it could be 50 million or 100 million tomorrow. Probation, including monitoring and compliance orders, and perhaps in some cases, most significantly, forfeiture of all the proceeds that result from that contract. So not just the profits, but all the proceeds. Even more chillingly is, of course, individual liability. I haven't put up jail terms that have occurred in the United States, but there have been some. Individuals can be charged and convicted, and then they get a criminal record if they have knowingly or been willfully blind to the circumstances giving rise to the offense and have participated, assisted, or encouraged a breach of those laws. And terms like that in the context of criminal law are also very broadly defined: assisting, encouraging. If you have some knowledge of it, you turn a blind eye to it, you give a tacit nod or encouragement to it, then you, as I've noted at the bottom, can face imprisonment for up to 5 years, as well as fines. As I mentioned, there are amendments to the Act that are now proposed. On February 5th, the Canadian government introduced amendments that would broaden the scope of the Act so that if you're a Canadian citizen, you can be susceptible to prosecution in Canada for any acts done anywhere in the world. Previously, there had to be what they called a real and substantial connection to Canada, but they're broadening the scope of the law so that we can reach out and pick up offenses that involve a Canadian individual, permanent resident, or Canadian corporation, even though all of the acts and involvement of the offense are in another country. That's not dissimilar to what's happened in England and also in the United States. They're proposing as well to increase the penalties to 14 years imprisonment, and as I mentioned, eliminate the facilitation payment exception. I should note that that's not that new either. In the UK law, which I'll talk about in a minute, there is no facilitation payment exception there either. And lastly, the amendments propose a new offense for concealing bribery in company accounting records. And this, as we'll see, is similar to the law that's existed in the United States for many years, which has a books and records requirement, so that you must be clear and transparent in your records. If you are paying consulting fees of any kind, if you're paying agents' fees, you must describe them accurately and clearly. To simply put down, as we read about in the paper, at least I did a few days ago, about one of the latest things involving SNC-Lavalin, and just simply vaguely describe things as consulting fees, you may well be breaking the law. These amendments have now cleared the Senate. They're before the House of Commons, and they're likely to come into force this fall. Let me just turn briefly to the American law. As I mentioned, the American law has been around for some time. It was brought in response to the Watergate scandal, and it has seen active enforcement by both the Department of Justice and the SEC. The Act is similar to ours, though with the two key differences, one of which I mentioned, books and records, but that difference is disappearing, and also the option for civil enforcement through the SEC. Again, like our law, the American law prohibits corruptly offering anything of value to a foreign public official for the purpose of influencing their decision or to somehow entice them to do business with you. It contains the similar exceptions to the CFPOA, such as the facilitation payment exception and if the bribe is legal in the country where you commit it. Though, as I've mentioned, facilitation payments are disappearing, and one should not count on countries not prohibiting bribes. Certainly not anymore. The English were late to the game. They only brought in their act a couple of years ago, but they now have a bribery act, and they have two designated groups in London that are actively enforcing their laws. It applies to both public and private bribery, has up to 10-year imprisonment, and like our laws, unlimited fines. What's different about the English law, there are two differences. One is a difference that may be disappearing, which is the point I note at the bottom of this slide, that they can prosecute you if you have any part of your business in the UK. Even though the entire elements of the bribing act, if I can call it that, are done in another country and the main headquarters of the company may be in Canada or the United States, the UK has a long-arm jurisdiction and can reach out and prosecute you in England. The second difference, and this is perhaps the more troubling one now, is the strict liability issue, which is that the UK does not require proof of knowledge or willful blindness. They have made it a strict liability offense, which imposes liability on you simply for failing to act diligently to prevent bribery. And so the main defense in the UK, and it'll become important in what I'm going to talk about in a minute, is that you've got to have adequate procedures in place to demonstrate to the authorities that if something bad happens, it's one bad actor, it's not the company, and the company itself has done its best to avoid having these bribes committed or conducted on their behalf. And so, in fact, the UK government has put out guidance to companies recommending that they have procedures in place, that they show a top-level commitment from the top down to ensuring that the company acts with integrity and does not commit bribes, that you conduct risk assessment, due diligence, the importance of communication is emphasized, training of employees, and also ongoing monitoring and review. And all of those elements make up an adequate anti-corruption compliance program. Before I get into that, I would leave you on this, I just want to also remind you that Canada itself has its own domestic anti-corruption laws. That's largely what the Quebec-Montreal inquiry is about. We have very strict laws for providing benefits to government officials. The government itself has very strict guidelines about receiving any kind of benefits. That's not to say they can't be provided, but they require pre-approval by supervisors. And even what might seem to be the most insignificant of benefits could constitute a breach of the law. Even provision of tickets to a sporting event, a meal, certainly a lavish meal, could be regarded as being offside of our Canadian anti-corruption laws. On the slide, I've written down as well that there's, of course, offenses for assisting or aiding or abetting a public official in committing a breach of trust, because that's in effect what they're doing when they're taking a bribe. And finally, as I mentioned, in the context of England, we also have laws against private bribery, and that's our secret commission offense, providing kickbacks to someone for awarding a contract. We have to be mindful of those too, and the compliance issues that I'm about to talk about really apply to all of this and are simply good business practice. So let's turn to that. I guess the first thing that I like to talk about is spotting the red flags and identifying the areas of risk that your organization may be at with respect to corruption. So here are some of the points that I like to point out. Close relationships with foreign officials, payments to accounts outside the country to cash or bearer, not surprisingly, payments of unusually large commissions, undisclosed subagents or associates, payments to or incurring expenses in respect of undisclosed persons. If your people you're hiring appear to lack the necessary qualifications that they ought to have for the job they're doing, if you're getting vague expense reports that lack transparency, and simply if your agent or partner resides outside the country, or certainly outside, as I'll come to, the countries where corruption, the risk of corruption is low. And that's really the last point, which is the alarm bell. And I like to show the map for this to illustrate best, which is whether your company is in the red. And that doesn't mean are you headquartered in the red, but are you doing business in one of these red countries. So as you can see, Canada's a nice pale yellow. The United States is a slightly deeper yellow, but then there are many other countries, virtually all of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, that are various shades of red. And of course, the darker the color, the more susceptible you are to getting involved with people who may be engaged in corruption. This is a map that's put out by Transparency International. The OECD and others all rely on this. They do a corruption index review every couple of years, and it's something to be very aware of when you're doing foreign business. So what should you be doing? We recommend compliance programs, as do the governments. As I mentioned, the English recommend this. The Canadian government and the US government have all been very clear in saying you should have compliance programs in place, and they will be to your benefit if, heaven forbid, something bad happens and you have a rogue employee or rogue agent who does something that they shouldn't be doing. Compliance programs include at least 4 essential components. One, and really the starting point, is to implement an appropriate anti-corruption policy. And that really is a policy that must come from the top. Everybody talks in terms of having a strong tone from the top of the company that any kind of corrupt activity will not be tolerated. So the policy is usually a broad and general policy that makes very clear the broad principles that corruption will not be tolerated. Secondly, you must train your officers and employees on the policy, and you must implement the policy. You must enforce the policy. At a more granular level, you should be reviewing your contract terms with agents and partners in foreign countries in particular to ensure that they contain provisions that prohibit corrupt activities by them. And finally, you should conduct periodic due diligence of them and generally within your company to ensure that you're complying with the broad principles. The anti-corruption policy itself, as I mentioned, sends a strong message that corruption and bribery will not be tolerated. Senior members of the company should be appointed to oversee compliance. That can sometimes be a compliance officer. It can be the chief legal officer. There's no right answer to that. Every company will be different in who they choose, but you must find someone at a sufficiently high level to enforce the policy and who has the substantial discretionary authority to really call the shots on it and hold people to account. The policy should also contain a mechanism for reporting violations. You've got to find a way to encourage the whistleblowers to come forward, and it's got to, of course, contain clear rules for gifts, hospitality, and travel, because that's really the tricky area where these things come up. Of course, as we've noted, even the best written policy is of little use if it's not implemented and enforced. You should engage in periodic training in addition to initial training once you bring a policy into effect, and you should be documenting your training. And you should be documenting all the steps that you do under the policy. So the compliance officer should be documenting requests to, for example, to give a gift to somebody. It's not necessarily prohibited, but it should be documented. And you must, and this is critically important now in Canadian law, you must maintain detailed and clear records, because there is now an offense coming in for inadequate record keeping. As I mentioned, due diligence should be performed and documented on all agents and joint venture partners. Ensure that the agents and partners are of good repute, that they're properly qualified, and they do not employ or are not related to foreign officials. And contracts, all contracts, should include these types of anti-corruption provisions. I guess the point here, though, is it's not enough to just put it in a contract. You really have to take some steps to show that you're being careful. I can tell you, I have a major multinational client that has never been able to establish a business in Latin America because they've never been able to fully satisfy themselves that they can comply with these kinds of requirements and be comfortable that they are not going into business with organizations that may have corrupt practices that they can't get to the bottom of. That company is an American-based company, and the person you've got to satisfy there is the CEO, because he or she's got to be able to go to sleep at night and not worry about facing personal prosecution. This is a serious issue. I think I've mentioned this, that there should be additional periodic due diligence performed on your agents and partners, and you should clearly and transparently document all of your actions. Periodic auditing and testing is prudent. And so, in conclusion, and I don't like making this sound preachy and a fear-mongering presentation, but the reality is there is significantly increased enforcement of these laws, not just in the United States, but at home in Canada and in the UK. These laws can reach out and get you wherever you do business in the world. And the message is that you've got to take steps to show that you're complying with these laws. And a robust compliance program, including both an effective policy, training, and appropriate due diligence and contractual terms, have now become an essential part of doing good business and avoiding these anti-corruption laws and anti-corruption prosecutions. And although I haven't talked about it, but I guess I could come back later, is to also warn you, I guess indirectly I've mentioned this, that if you're thinking of going into business with partners in other countries, then you've also got to conduct significant due diligence in those transactions. So with that, I'm sorry I'm not present in person to give this presentation, but my email is on the front of this, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.